The afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Cathedral, casting kaleidoscope patterns across the faces of nearly 300 guests. Sarah Parker stood before the altar, a vision in white lace and silk, her dark hair perfectly arranged beneath a cathedral-length veil. At 28, she embodied grace and sophistication, though something fierce flickered behind her smile. Richard Bennett, the 55-year-old groom, beamed with undisguised joy. His silver hair caught the light, and his warm brown eyes never left his bride's face. The guests whispered among themselves about how the wealthy businessman had finally found happiness after his tragic past. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, his voice echoing through the vast space, "we are gathered here today." The heavy wooden doors at the back of the church suddenly burst open with a thunderous crack. The sound reverberated through the sacred space like a gunshot, causing several guests to gasp. A small figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, breathing heavily. Tommy Wilson, 10 years old, clothed in a dirt-stained shirt and torn jeans, clutched a manila envelope and a cassette tape to his chest. His bare feet left muddy prints on the pristine white carpet as he stepped into the church. "Stop," his young voice carried clearly through the stunned silence. "You can't marry her, Mr. Bennett. She's not who you think she is." Sarah's perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her bouquet of white roses, her knuckles turning as white as the petals. "Security," she hissed through clenched teeth, but Tommy was already running down the aisle. "She steals from the orphanage," he shouted, waving the envelope. "She hurts us. She locks kids in the basement. It's all here, the proof, the money, everything." The boy reached into his envelope and pulled out financial documents, their pages fluttering to the floor like autumn leaves. "Play this tape," he pleaded, holding up the cassette. "Listen to what she says when she thinks nobody's watching." Sarah's composed facade cracked. For a split second, something dark and terrifying flashed across her face. She lunged forward, reaching for the tape, but stumbled on her designer heels. The movement sent her bouquet flying, white roses scattering across the altar steps like fallen stars. Richard stood frozen, his eyes moving between his bride and the desperate child. In that moment, everything he thought he knew began to unravel, like a loose thread being pulled from an elaborate tapestry. "This boy is clearly disturbed," Sarah recovered quickly, her voice honey-sweet but trembling. "He's one of our troubled cases from the orphanage. Security, please remove him." But Tommy's next words stopped everyone in their tracks. "Tell them about the basement, Miss Sarah. Tell them about my sister Emily." The color drained from Sarah's face. She swayed slightly, her hand reaching for support that wasn't there. The cathedral fell into a silence so profound that the flutter of birds in the rafters echoed like thunder. Join us on an unforgettable journey of love, betrayal, and redemption. Subscribe now to unlock more captivating stories that touch your soul. Richard Bennett stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the sun cast long shadows across the city he had helped build. At 55, his silver hair and distinguished features spoke of experience, but his warm brown eyes held a lingering sadness that wealth couldn't erase. 20 years of building his real estate empire hadn't filled the void left by the tragic accident that took his wife Grace and 5-year-old daughter Emma. The photographs on his desk told the story of his lost Grace's radiant smile as she held their newborn daughter, Emma's first steps in their garden, their last family vacation at the beach. Each frame preserved a moment of happiness from a life that seemed to belong to someone else now. The accident had been swift and merciless, a drunk driver on a rainy night, a slippery road, and in an instant his world had shattered. In the years that followed, Richard had thrown himself into his work, transforming Bennett Enterprises from a modest real estate firm into a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He built schools, hospitals, and community centers, trying to create something meaningful from his pain. His employees spoke of his kindness, his inability to walk past someone in need without stopping to help. The media called him the compassionate mogul, but few understood that his generosity stemmed from a desperate attempt to give his life purpose. The loneliness of his existence was reflected in his home, a sprawling mansion filled with expensive art, but devoid of the laughter and warmth he remembered. The East Wing, which he had once planned as Emma's playroom, remained locked, a shrine to dreams that would never be realized. Each night he would stand in the doorway, imagining the life that could have been, before retiring to his study with a glass of scotch and memories for company. Everything changed when he met Sarah Parker at a charity gala for children's education. Her passion for helping orphaned children had sparked something in him he thought had died with Grace and Emma. Her dedication to running the Hope Haven orphanage seemed like a sign perhaps this was his chance to heal, to create a new family while helping children who had lost their own. But beneath his successful exterior and newfound hope, Richard carried deep wounds. He blamed himself for working late the night of the accident, for not being there to drive his family home. The guilt had shaped him into someone who struggled to trust his own judgment in personal matters, even as he made million-dollar business decisions with unwavering confidence. His proposal to Sarah had been both an act of love and an attempt at redemption. In her, he saw the possibility of not just personal happiness, but a chance to make a difference in the lives of countless children. The wedding preparations had filled his empty mansion with activity and purpose, making him feel truly alive for the first time in decades. Yet there were moments, quiet instances when Sarah thought he wasn't watching, when something in her expression reminded him of the shadows he sometimes glimpsed in his own mirror, a darkness born of loss and pain. He had dismissed these observations, attributing them to his own paranoia and fear of happiness. After all, who was he to question the authenticity of someone's kindness when his own philanthropic work stemmed from such personal tragedy? As the wedding day approached, Richard found himself standing more frequently in Emma's unopened playroom, seeking guidance from ghosts who couldn't answer. "Would you approve?" he would whisper to Grace's photograph, but only silence echoed back. The room remained a testament to his past, even as he prepared to step into a future that promised to fill his life with the family he had lost and the purpose he desperately sought. Sarah Parker stood before her full-length mirror, methodically applying her signature red lipstick. At 28, she had mastered the art of presentation, every gesture calculated, every smile precisely measured. Her designer clothes and impeccable manners served as armor, concealing a past she had spent years trying to erase. The spacious apartment she maintained near Hope Haven Orphanage was a testament to her carefully constructed image. Modern art adorned the walls, each piece selected not for appreciation but for the status it conveyed. Everything in her life was chosen with surgical precision, from her charitable work to her engagement to Richard Bennett. Even her position as director of Hope Haven had been part of a meticulously crafted plan. What the world saw was Sarah Parker, the dedicated humanitarian, young, beautiful, and selflessly devoted to helping orphaned children. Local newspapers frequently featured her, praising her innovative programs at Hope Haven and her ability to secure donations from wealthy benefactors. Her engagement to Richard Bennett had been portrayed as a fairy tale, the compassionate philanthropist finding love with a like-minded soul. But beneath the polished surface lurked memories of Sarah Wilson, a scared little girl abandoned at that very same orphanage 20 years ago. She remembered the cold nights, the gnawing hunger, the crushing feeling of worthlessness. While other children dreamed of being adopted, young Sarah had learned a harder lesson in this world. Power was the only protection against pain. She had clawed her way out of poverty through sheer determination, changing her last name and creating a new identity. Her intelligence and beauty became weapons, her charm a carefully honed tool. Each step up the social ladder had been calculated, each relationship cultivated for its potential value. The children at Hope Haven were merely props in her performance, their suffering a necessary component of her rise to power. In private moments, Sarah would sometimes catch her own reflection and see traces of that abandoned child. These glimpses would trigger a rage so profound it frightened even her. She channeled this anger into her ambitions, using it to fuel her relentless pursuit of wealth and status. The orphanage became her kingdom, a place where she could exercise the control she had never had as a child. But her engagement to Richard Bennett represented the culmination of years of planning. His wealth and influence would finally give her the security she craved, and his tragic past made him perfectly vulnerable to her manipulations. She had studied him for months before their chance meeting at the charity gala, learning his habits, his weaknesses, and most importantly, his guilt over his family's death. The irony of using an orphanage to advance her goals was not lost on her. Each time she walked through Hope Haven's halls, past the hungry children and cold dormitories, she felt a twisted satisfaction. These children would learn the same lesson she had: the world was cruel, and only the strong survived. Yet sometimes, in the dead of night, Sarah would wake from dreams of her own childhood, her heart racing and her pillow wet with tears. These moments of vulnerability would be quickly suppressed, buried beneath layers of ambition and carefully constructed lies. She had not come this far to be undone by sentiment. As her wedding day approached, Sarah focused on the final details of her plan. Soon she would have everything she had ever wanted: wealth, power, and the absolute certainty that she would never be powerless again. The price of her ambitions would be paid by others, just as she had paid the price of others' greed in her childhood. It was, she believed, simply the natural order of things. Tommy Wilson sat in the corner of Hope Haven's dormitory, his small fingers tracing the worn photograph of a smiling toddler, his sister Emily. At 10 years old, his eyes carried a wisdom far beyond his years, a result of experiencing more pain than any child should endure. Despite his young age, Tommy had become the unofficial protector of the younger children at Hope Haven, sharing his meager food portions and offering comfort during the cold nights. The siblings had been separated 3 years ago when Emily, then only 4, was moved to what Sarah Parker called the special care section of the orphanage. Tommy had been allowed to see her only twice since then, each visit supervised and brief. The last time, Emily had seemed different, quieter, fearful, her once bright eyes dulled by something Tommy couldn't understand but knew was wrong. During the day, Tommy attended the local public school, where he excelled in his studies despite the challenges of his circumstances. His teachers often remarked on his extraordinary intelligence and questioning mind, though they worried about the dark circles under his eyes and his worn clothing. At night, he would secretly teach the younger children to read and write, using books he borrowed from the school library. His observant nature had made him particularly dangerous to Sarah Parker's operation. He noticed the discrepancies between the donations the orphanage received and the conditions they lived in. He saw how food deliveries would arrive but never make it to the children's plates. Most importantly, he heard conversations in offices late at night, angry phone calls, and the muffled cries from the basement that the staff pretended not to notice. Tommy had developed a system of hiding places throughout the orphanage: loose floorboards, forgotten storage closets, spaces between walls. These hidden nooks became his reconnaissance posts, allowing him to piece together the dark truth about Hope Haven and its director. He kept a small notebook, carefully documenting dates, conversations, and observations in his neat, childish handwriting. The other children looked up to Tommy as their leader and protector. When the youngest ones cried from hunger, he would tell them stories about brave knights and magical kingdoms where good always triumphed over evil. He organized small acts of resistance, sharing food, creating makeshift blankets from discarded materials, and maintaining a network of lookouts to warn of Sarah's unexpected inspections. But it was Emily who drove him to take the ultimate risk. The night he overheard Sarah's plans for after the wedding plans that included disposing of troublesome children, Tommy knew he had to act. The thought of his sister in danger gave him the courage to break into Sarah's office, to gather the evidence that would expose the truth, no matter the cost to himself. His small frame carried the weight of responsibility far too heavy for his young shoulders, yet beneath the serious exterior was still a child who longed for the simple comfort of a family's love. He kept a secret collection of newspaper clippings about happy adoptions, dreaming of a day when he and Emily might find a real home together. Deep inside, Tommy carried a spark of hope that refused to be extinguished by the harsh realities of his life. He believed in justice, in the power of truth to overcome evil, even when everything around him suggested otherwise. This unwavering faith, combined with his natural intelligence and protective instincts, made him a formidable opponent to Sarah's schemes, despite his young age. As the wedding day approached, Tommy felt the weight of his mission growing heavier. The evidence he had gathered was his only weapon against Sarah's carefully constructed facade. The lives of Emily and all the other children at Hope Haven depended on his courage to speak the truth. In his heart, he knew that stopping the wedding might be his only chance to save not just his sister, but all the forgotten children of Hope Haven. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Manhattan's busy streets as Richard Bennett left his office, his mind preoccupied with wedding details. Sarah had been sending him messages all day about final arrangements, flowers, seating charts, the band's playlist. His phone buzzed again as he slipped behind the wheel of his Mercedes, Sarah's smiling profile photo lighting up the screen. "Just one quick response," he muttered, his fingers moving across the keyboard. The message was about the flowers for the church, white roses or lilies, a decision that seemed crucial to Sarah. The traffic light ahead had just turned green, and Richard was still looking down at his phone, trying to craft the perfect response to appease his perfectionist fiancée. He never saw Tommy Wilson dart out from between the parked cars. The sound of impact was sickeningly soft, a muffled thud followed by a child's cry cut short. Richard's foot slammed on the brake, the tires screaming against the asphalt. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as he watched a small body roll across his hood and crumple to the ground. "No, dear God, no." Richard's voice was barely recognizable as he scrambled out of the car. The boy lay motionless on the pavement, one sneaker knocked several feet away by the impact. A crowd was already gathering, phones raised to record the scene, voices murmuring accusations and concern. Richard fell to his knees beside the child, his hands hovering helplessly over the small, broken form. Blood trickled from a cut on the boy's forehead, and his clothes, already worn and patched, were torn from the impact. "Someone call an ambulance," Richard shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. The boy's eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing a depth of intelligence and fear that pierced Richard's heart. "Hold on, son," Richard whispered, carefully cradling the child's head. "Help is coming." "I'm so sorry. I'm so terribly sorry." The minutes until the ambulance arrived felt like hours. Richard stayed by the boy's side, speaking softly, trying to keep him conscious. He noticed details that would haunt him later: the holes in the child's socks, the way his ribs showed through his thin shirt, the small notebook that had fallen from his pocket, its pages covered in careful handwriting. When the paramedics finally arrived, Richard insisted on accompanying them to the hospital. His phone continued to buzz with messages from Sarah, but he couldn't bring himself to look at it. The device that had caused this tragedy now felt like a burning coal in his pocket. In the emergency room, Richard paced the sterile hallway, his expensive suit wrinkled, his silver hair disheveled from running his hands through it countless times. The guilt was overwhelming. He had been distracted by wedding flowers while a child ran for his life, though he didn't yet understand the true significance of that fact. "Mr. Bennett," a nurse approached with a clipboard. "We need some information about the boy." Richard's stomach twisted as he realized he knew nothing about the child he had hit. I don't know him," he admitted, shame coloring his voice. "It was an accident." "I was looking at my phone." The confession felt like acid in his mouth. The nurse's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing disapproval. He had no identification on him, but he was carrying this. She handed Richard the notebook she had found in the boy's pocket. "There's a name inside: Tommy Wilson." Richard opened the notebook with trembling hands. The neat, childish writing detailed observations about daily life at Hope Haven Orphanage, missing food deliveries, locked basement doors, children's cries in the night. His blood ran cold as he recognized the name of the institution his fiancée ran with such acclaimed dedication. Hope Haven, he whispered more to himself than the nurse. But that's... Before he could finish the thought, a doctor burst through the emergency room doors. "Mr. Bennett, the boy is stabilized, but there's something you need to see." The doctor's face was grave as he held up an X-ray. "These older injuries, they're not from the accident. This child has been systematically abused." Richard felt the world tilt beneath his feet. In one terrible moment, everything began to connect: the orphanage, Sarah's passionate dedication to her work, and now this battered child with his notebook full of dark secrets. The wedding flowers suddenly seemed very far away indeed. Sarah Parker was in the middle of a wedding consultation when her phone buzzed with an urgent message from Hope Haven's night supervisor. Her perfectly manicured nails paused over a sample of silk ribbons as she read the text: "Tommy Wilson missing. Last seen heading downtown. Files compromised." The color drained from her face, though her composure never wavered. "Excuse me," she smiled sweetly at the florist. "A small emergency at the orphanage requires my attention." Her heels clicked purposefully across the marble floor as she made her way to her car, her mind already calculating potential damage control scenarios. The drive to Hope Haven was tense, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Tommy Wilson had always been a problem: too observant, too clever, asking questions that shouldn't be asked. She should have dealt with him sooner, but his sister had provided such useful leverage to keep him in line. As she strode through Hope Haven's dim corridors, the children shrank away from her approach. Her outward appearance, designer suit, perfect makeup, gentle smile contrasted sharply with the fear she inspired in them. The night supervisor, James, met her at the office door, his face pale with anxiety. "He took files, MS," Parker, James stammered. And one of the recording devices from the safe." Sarah's calm facade cracked for a moment, real fear flashing across her features. Those recordings contained conversations that could destroy everything she had built: discussions about embezzled funds, plans for after the wedding, threats made in unguarded moments. She reached her office and found it exactly as James had described: the safe partially open, key files missing, and most worryingly, the absence of the small tape recorder she used to document her meetings. Her mind raced through the implications. If Tommy had those recordings, if he understood what they meant. Her phone rang again, and her heart stopped when she saw Richard's name on the screen. "Sarah, there's been an accident." His voice was shaky, unlike his usual confident tone. I hit a child with my car. He's from Hope Haven." The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of irony. Sarah sank into a leather chair, her free hand gripping the armrest. "Oh, Richard, how terrible! Which child? Are they all right?" Her voice was perfectly modulated to convey concern while her mind raced through contingency plans. "His name is Tommy Wilson." Richard's words hit her like a physical blow. "He's stable now, but Sarah, there are signs of previous abuse. The doctors are asking questions." Sarah's training kicked in, years of manipulation and damage control taking over. "Tommy is one of our most troubled cases," she said smoothly. "He often runs away, gets into fights. We've been trying to help him, but..." She let her voice trail off, implying a history of self-inflicted injuries and behavioral issues. "I'm at Metropolitan Hospital," Richard continued. "Maybe you could bring his files? Help explain his situation to the doctors." "Of course, darling," Sarah replied, her mind already crafting a narrative that would explain away any suspicious injuries. "I'll be there as soon as I can gather the necessary documentation." After hanging up, Sarah's composed expression dissolved into one of cold fury. She pressed the intercom button. "James, bring Emily Wilson to my office. Now." Minutes later, a small girl with Tommy's same dark eyes was led into the room. At 7 years old, Emily still carried traces of the infant beauty that had made her valuable to Sarah's other enterprises. "But sit down," Emily, Sarah said, her voice honey-sweet but laced with poison. "Your brother has been very naughty," she continued, watching the child's face pale. "He's trying to ruin everything, and now he's gotten himself hurt. You remember what happens to children who cause trouble, don't you?" Emily nodded mutely, her small hands clutching the hem of her worn dress. Sarah reached out to stroke the girl's hair, a gesture that made Emily flinch. "So you'll be a good girl and tell the doctors exactly what I tell you to say, won't you? For Tommy's sake." The child's whispered yes, Ms. Parker, was barely audible, but it was enough. Sarah stood smoothing her skirt and gathering the carefully edited versions of Tommy's files she would present to the hospital. She had spent years building her empire of lies, and she wasn't about to let one observant child tear it down. As she left her office, Sarah caught her reflection in the window, perfect, poised, and utterly ruthless. She had clawed her way out of poverty through far worse situations than this. Tommy Wilson would learn, as she had, that the truth was a luxury some people couldn't afford. At Metropolitan Hospital, Tommy Wilson drifted in and out of consciousness, the harsh fluorescent lights blurring above him. Through the haze of pain medication, he was acutely aware of the missing weight of his notebook and the recordings his evidence, his only hope of exposing Sarah Parker's crimes. The door to his hospital room opened, and he heard Richard Bennett's voice speaking softly with the doctors. Tommy forced his eyes open, trying to focus on the man who had accidentally hit him. Despite his pain and fear, he recognized something in Richard's face that he had rarely seen in adults: genuine concern and remorse. "He's awake," the doctor announced, approaching Tommy's bedside. "Hello there, young man. How are you feeling?" Tommy tried to speak, but his throat was dry. Richard quickly offered him water, holding the cup carefully to his lips. The simple act of kindness nearly brought tears to Tommy's eyes. How long had it been since an adult had shown him such gentle consideration? "Mr. Bennett," Tommy managed to whisper, his voice urgent despite its weakness. "You need to know. Hope Haven, Ms. Parker." The sound of clicking heels in the hallway cut him off. Sarah Parker appeared in the doorway, her presence immediately filling the room with an invisible tension. Tommy instinctively tried to shrink deeper into the hospital bed, his heart monitor betraying his fear with quickened beeps. "Oh, you poor dear," Sarah cooed, her voice dripping with false sympathy. She moved to Tommy's bedside, opposite Richard. As she leaned down to smooth his hair, she whispered in his ear, so quietly that only he could hear. "Emily sends her love. It would be a shame if anything happened to her while you're here." Tommy's face went pale, and the heart monitor's beeping became more erratic. Richard noticed the change, his brow furrowing with concern. "Sarah, perhaps we should let him rest," he suggested, but Sarah was already pulling out a file folder. "I brought Tommy's records," she announced to the doctor. "As you can see, he has a history of self-destructive behavior. Running away, getting into fights." She began laying out papers that Tommy had never seen before, documents that painted a picture of a troubled, violent child. "That's not true," Tommy protested weakly, but Sarah continued as if he hadn't spoken, her voice smooth and professional as she detailed his supposed psychological issues and past injuries. Richard stood silently, watching the interaction. Something about the scene bothered him, the way Tommy's heart rate had spiked when Sarah entered, the fear in the boy's eyes that seemed at odds with Sarah's description of a troubled troublemaker. "Sarah," Richard interrupted suddenly, "how did you know to bring these files so quickly? I only just called you about the accident." A brief flash of something: surprise? Anger? Crossed Sarah's face before her professional mask slipped back into place. "Oh, we had already noticed Tommy was missing. I was gathering these files to file a police report when you called." But Richard was already reaching for Tommy's notebook, which he had placed on the bedside table. "Then, how do you explain this?" he asked, opening to a page filled with careful observations and numbers. "These look like financial records, Sarah. Records of donations that never seem to reach the children." Sarah's composure cracked slightly. "Richard, darling, surely you're not going to believe the scribblings of a disturbed child over your own fiancée." Tommy gathered his courage, knowing this might be his only chance. "Check the tape recorder," he said, his voice stronger now. "The one in my jacket pocket. Ms. Parker records everything in her office. She doesn't know I took it." The color drained from Sarah's face as Richard retrieved the small device from Tommy's torn jacket. "It's all there," Tommy continued. "How she steals the donation money, what she does to the children in the basement, what she's planning after the wedding." "This is ridiculous," Sarah snapped, reaching for the recorder, but Richard held it away from her grasp. The look in his eyes had changed the loving trust replaced by growing suspicion. "Sarah," he said quietly, "why don't we listen to this tape together?" In that moment, as Sarah's carefully constructed world began to unravel, Tommy saw something he had never expected to see: fear in the eyes of the woman who had terrorized him and so many others. The truth, so long buried under layers of lies and manipulation, was finally clawing its way to the surface. The doctor and nurses had withdrawn discreetly, leaving the three of them in a tableau of confrontation: Richard holding the tape recorder, Sarah frozen in barely contained panic, and Tommy, small and battered, but finally being heard. The hospital room fell into a heavy silence as Richard pressed play on the tape recorder. Sarah's voice, cold and calculating, filled the space. "Once we're married, half of everything he owns becomes mine. The orphanage, the donations, the children, they're just means to an end, and those who know too much." The threat in her tone was unmistakable. Richard's face transformed as he listened, the color draining from his features as recording after recording revealed the depths of Sarah's deception. Conversations about embezzled funds, plans for after the wedding, cruel discussions about the children's treatment. Each revelation struck him like a physical blow. "Stop," Sarah commanded, reaching for the recorder, but Richard held it away from her grasp. Her perfectly maintained facade was cracking, desperation seeping through the fissures. "Richard, darling, this isn't what it sounds like. I can explain everything." Explain. Richard's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of mountains. "Explain how you've been stealing from innocent children, how you've been using my name, my reputation to facilitate your crimes." His hands were shaking as he rewound the tape to another conversation. Tommy watched from his hospital bed, his heart pounding. He had never seen an adult stand up to Sarah before. The fear that had been his constant companion for so long began to mix with something unfamiliar: hope. "Tell him about Emily," Tommy said suddenly, his voice stronger than he expected. "Tell him what you did to my sister." Sarah's head snapped toward him, her eyes flashing with murderous rage. "Be quiet," she hissed, but Tommy continued, drawing strength from Richard's protective presence. "She keeps her in the basement with the others," he pressed on. "The ones she sells to special families. That's where the real money comes from." Richard staggered back as if physically struck. Child trafficking, the word seemed to stick in his throat. "Sarah, please tell me this isn't true. Tell me I haven't been financing." But Sarah's response was not what anyone expected. She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that held no trace of her usual carefully cultivated charm. "Finance it, Richard, you made it possible. Your reputation, your connections, your blind trust, you gave me everything I needed to build my empire." But she moved toward him, her designer heels clicking on the hospital floor. "Do you know what it's like to grow up with nothing? To be one of those children you so generously help with your charity? I learned early that in this world power is the only protection, and I swore I would never be powerless again." Richard's face hardened with each word. "Security," he called out, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "And someone get child services on the phone. Now." Sarah's demeanor shifted instantly, the mask of confidence falling away to reveal raw panic. She lunged for the door, but hospital security was already there, responding to the elevated voices and Tommy's increased heart rate. "You can't prove anything," she snarled as the guards took hold of her arms. "It's your word against mine, and who will believe a troubled orphan and a man too blind to see what was happening in his own charity? But Richard was already pulling out his phone, his fingers flying over the keys. Davidson, he barked into the device, "I need our entire legal team at Metropolitan Hospital. Now. And send investigators to Hope Haven Orphanage. Focus on the basement. Look for a girl named Emily Wilson." Tommy felt tears sliding down his cheeks, tears of relief, of vindication, of hope for his sister. Richard noticed and moved to his bedside, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're safe now, son," he said softly. "Both you and Emily will be safe. I promise." As security led Sarah away, she turned back one last time. In that moment, her beauty seemed to fade, revealing something hard and twisted beneath. "You'll regret this," she spat. "Both of you. Nobody crosses Sarah Parker without consequences." But her threats fell flat in the face of Richard's quiet determination and Tommy's unwavering courage. The last thing she saw before being led away was Richard Bennett, billionaire philanthropist, sitting on the edge of a hospital bed, carefully wiping tears from the face of a brave little boy who had dared to tell the truth. The truth about Hope Haven was about to come to light, but none of them yet realized that this was just the beginning. Sarah Parker's empire of lies was crumbling, but its collapse would reveal secrets that would change all their lives forever, secrets that had been buried for far longer than anyone suspected. The next 24 hours at Hope Haven Orphanage unfolded like scenes from a nightmare. Police cars and child services vehicles filled the parking lot, their lights painting the grey building in alternating red and blue. Richard stood with the investigators as they broke the locks on the basement door, his heart pounding with dread at what they might find. The basement revealed horrors beyond imagination. Hidden behind false walls were small rooms, each containing narrow beds and minimal facilities. Documents scattered across Sarah's office told the story children categorized by market value. Detailed records of transactions disguised as adoptions and lists of wealthy clients who had paid premium prices for their special orders. Mr. Bennett called one of the investigators, holding up a file. "You need to see this." The document was yellowed with age, dating back almost 30 years. It contained adoption records, including one that made Richard's blood run cold, a photograph of a young Sarah Parker, then known as Sarah Wilson, standing next to a much younger version of himself at a charity event. The memory hit him like a thunderbolt. He had been a young businessman then, just starting to build his empire. He had visited the orphanage as part of a community outreach program, and there had been a girl, bright, ambitious, with eyes that seemed too old for her face. He had promised to help her, to ensure she got a good education, but then the pressures of business had taken over, and he had forgotten. "She was here," he whispered, the weight of responsibility crushing his chest. "She was one of them, and I forgot about her." But there was more. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered another file, this one bearing Tommy's name. The DNA test results inside sent Richard staggering against the wall. 20 years ago, during a dark period after losing his wife and daughter, he had made a mistake, a brief relationship with a woman who had disappeared shortly after. The dates matched. The blood type matched. Tommy wasn't just any orphan, he was Richard's son. Upstairs, social workers were interviewing the children, documenting years of neglect and abuse. In a small room off the main dormitory, they found Emily Wilson, Tommy's sister. The 7-year-old was curled in a corner, clutching a worn teddy bear, her dark eyes so like her brother's wide with fear and hope. Richard knelt before her, his voice gentle. "Hello, Emily. I'm a friend of Tommy's." The girl studied him warily, years of learned distrust evident in her posture. "Your brother has been very brave," he continued. "And he's been looking for you for a very long time." Emily's lower lip trembled. "Is Tommy okay?" "MS. Parker said he was hurt bad." Richard felt tears prick his eyes. "He's going to be just fine. And so are you. Would you like to see him?" The girl nodded, and as Richard helped her gather her few belongings, he noticed a small locket around her neck. Inside was a photograph of a young woman with Tommy's eyes and Emily's smile. Their mother, he realized with a start, the woman he had known so briefly all those years ago. The evidence against Sarah mounted by the hour. Financial records revealed millions in embezzled donations, offshore accounts filled with profits from illegal adoptions, and a network of corruption that stretched into the highest levels of society. But it was the personal betrayals that cut deepest. How she had known all along that Tommy was Richard's son, but had kept them apart, how she had used her own past as an orphan to manipulate and abuse other children. As night fell, Richard sat in his office at home, surrounded by files and photographs. The image of Sarah as a young orphan haunted him. He had been her chance at a different life, and his negligence had helped create the monster she became. Now, by some twist of fate, she had nearly succeeded in destroying his own son, the child he hadn't known existed. His phone buzzed with a message from the hospital. Tommy was asking for him. The boy had been quiet since Sarah's arrest, processing the day's events. The doctors were concerned about his emotional state, especially once he learned about his true parentage. Richard stared at the message, fear and hope warring in his heart. He had failed Sarah all those years ago, failed to protect his unknown son and daughter, failed to see what was happening right under his nose at Hope Haven. But now he had a chance to make things right, not just for Tommy and Emily, but for all the children who had suffered under Sarah's reign of terror. As he grabbed his coat and headed for the hospital, Richard knew that the hardest part of their journey was just beginning. Trust, once broken, was not easily rebuilt. But as he thought of Tommy's courage and Emily's resilience, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the fierce, protective love of a father. In the depths of the city jail, Sarah Parker sat in the interrogation room, her designer clothes replaced by an orange jumpsuit, her perfectly manicured nails chipped and broken. Across the table sat Detective Laura Hayes, spreading photographs across the metal surface, images of the basement rooms at Hope Haven, financial documents and faces of children who had disappeared through Sarah's special adoption program. 28 cases so far, Detective Hayes stated coldly. 28 children sold to the highest bidder. And those are just the ones we can prove. She leaned forward, studying Sarah's face. But what I want to know is why. Why did someone who escaped the system choose to perpetuate its worst abuses? Sarah's laugh was hollow, echoing off the concrete walls. Escaped. Is that what you think I did? She picked up one of the photos, her younger self at Hope Haven. I learned the truth about power in that place. The strong survive by stepping on the weak. I just perfected the system. The detective pulled out another file, this one containing Sarah's original orphanage records. Your parents didn't abandon you, Miss Parker. Or should I say MS Wilson? They died trying to protect you during a home invasion. You were 3 years old. The system failed you, yes, but you weren't thrown away. You were loved. The words hit Sarah like physical blows, cracking the armor she had built over decades. Her hands began to shake as she stared at the document she had never seen before: the police report of her parents' death, their life insurance policy that should have provided for her care, the letters from relatives who had tried to find her but been thwarted by bureaucratic errors. No, she whispered, her voice losing its usual polish. You're lying. I was abandoned, forgotten. Like all the others, but even as she spoke, memories began to surface, fragments of warmth and love that she had buried beneath years of bitterness and rage. Your father died shielding you with his body, Detective Hayes continued relentlessly. Your mother's last words to the paramedics were asking about your safety. And now look at what you've become, everything they died trying to protect you from. Sarah's composure finally shattered. Years of carefully constructed walls crumbled as she stared at a photograph she had never seen before, her parents holding her as a toddler, all three smiling at the camera. The love in their eyes was unmistakable. What have I done? She whispered, her voice breaking. What have I become? The detective pushed forward one final photograph: Tommy and Emily Wilson. These children, they're not just any victims, are they? They're your family. Their mother was your cousin, the one who spent years trying to find you after your parents died. Sarah's world tilted on its axis. The children she had tormented, the boy who had exposed her crimes, the sister she had used as leverage, they were the family she had convinced herself didn't exist. The realization of what she had done to her own blood relations broke something fundamental inside her. "I didn't know," she gasped, tears finally breaking through her careful control. "I never knew." "No, Detective Hayes agreed, her voice softening slightly. "But you chose not to look. You chose to believe the worst about your past, and then you made that nightmare reality for other children." Sarah's shoulders began to shake with suppressed sobs. The carefully constructed narrative of her life, the abandoned orphan who had clawed her way to power, was unraveling in the face of a truth too painful to bear. She had become the very monster she had feared as a child. "Can I?" she hesitated, her voice small and unfamiliar even to herself. "Can I write to them? To Tommy and Emily. Not to ask forgiveness, I don't deserve that. But to explain. To tell them about their mother, about our family." Detective Hayes gathered the photographs, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes holding a hint of compassion. "That will be up to their guardian, Richard Bennett, the man you tried to destroy while hiding the fact that his son was right under your nose." As the detective stood to leave, Sarah called out one last time. "Detective, the other children, the ones I sold, can they be found?" "We're already working on it. Thanks to Tommy's evidence and your records, we have leads on most of them." The detective paused at the door. "You can help make this right, Ms. Parker. It won't change what you've done, but you can help us bring those children home." Left alone in the interrogation room, Sarah Parker, the orphan who had become a monster, faced the ruins of her life's careful lies. On the table before her lay the truth she had spent decades running from. She had never been unloved, only lost. And in her quest for power and revenge against imagined wrongs, she had inflicted real horror on innocent children, including her own family. The sobs that finally broke free were those of Sarah Wilson, the 3-year-old girl who had lost everything and forgotten she was loved. They echoed off the concrete walls, a requiem for the person she might have been, and perhaps the first step toward the person she could still become. The spring sunlight streamed through the windows of Metropolitan Hospital as Richard Bennett sat beside Tommy's bed, watching his newly discovered son sleep. The boy's bruises were healing, but the emotional wounds would take far longer to mend. On the small bedside table lay a stack of documents, DNA test results, birth certificates, and court papers that would legally unite father and son. Emily was curled up in a chair on the other side of the bed, her small hand clutching her brother's. She hadn't left Tommy's side since their reunion, as if afraid he might disappear again. The teddy bear Richard had bought her was tucked under her arm, the first new toy she'd owned in years. She still startled at sudden movements and rarely spoke above a whisper, but there were moments when a smile would break through, transforming her face into a mirror image of her mother's photograph. Richard studied both children's faces, seeing echoes of himself in Tommy's determined chin and hints of their mother in Emily's gentle expressions. The weight of lost time pressed heavily on his heart, years he could never get back, birthdays he had missed, first days of school he hadn't known about. But more than regret, he felt a fierce determination to make things right. "Mr. Bennett," Emily's soft voice broke through his thoughts. She still couldn't bring herself to call him Dad, and he didn't push. "Will they make us go back to Hope Haven?" Richard moved to kneel beside her chair, his voice gentle but firm. "Never. You're home now, both of you, and I promise you'll never have to go back there." Tommy stirred in his sleep, mumbling something about protecting his sister. Even unconscious, his first thought was for Emily's safety. Richard felt his throat tighten with emotion, pride in his son's courage, mixed with sorrow for the circumstances that had forced a child to be so strong. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Dr. Sarah Matthews, the child psychologist who had been working with both children. She carried a folder thick with notes and assessments, her face bearing the weight of what she had learned about their experiences. "Mr. Bennett," she began, taking a seat across from him, "we need to discuss the children's recovery plan. The trauma they've experienced," she glanced at Emily, who had dozed off, still clutching her brother's hand. "It's extensive, but not insurmountable." Richard nodded, ready to do whatever was necessary to help his children heal. Dr. Matthews outlined a comprehensive treatment plan, therapy sessions, both individual and family, educational assessments to determine proper school placement, and strategies for helping them adjust to their new life. "The most important thing right now is stability," she explained. "They need to know they're safe, that they're wanted, and that they have control over their own lives. After what they've been through, trust will be the hardest thing to rebuild." As if to emphasize her point, Emily whimpered in her sleep, caught in what was clearly a nightmare. Richard moved instinctively to comfort her, but Dr. Matthews held up a hand, stopping him. "Let her brother handle it," she advised softly. Sure enough, even in his sleep, Tommy reached out to pat his sister's hand, murmuring words of comfort. Emily settled immediately, her features relaxing back into peaceful slumber. The bond between the siblings was profound, forged in the crucible of their shared trauma. "They're survivors," Dr. Matthews observed, "but they shouldn't have had to be. The system failed them multiple times, failed to identify them as your children, failed to protect them from abuse, failed to keep them safe. The road ahead won't be easy." Richard's jaw set with determination. "Whatever they need, therapy, education, time, love, they'll have it. I've already started renovating the east wing of the house, the one that was supposed to be." He paused, emotion thick in his voice. "The one that was meant for Emma." Dr. Matthews nodded, understanding. She knew about Richard's lost daughter, how the east wing had remained sealed like a shrine to what might have been. Using that space for Tommy and Emily, it's a healthy step forward for all of you. The conversation was interrupted by Tommy stirring awake, his eyes immediately searching for his sister, then relaxing when he found her safe beside him. "Dad," he called softly, the word still new and precious on his lips. Richard was at his side instantly. "I'm here, son. Can we really stay with you forever?" The question broke Richard's heart all over again, that after everything, Tommy still feared being sent away. He took his son's hand, careful of the IV line. "Tommy, listen to me. You and Emily are my children. You always were, even when I didn't know it. And nothing will ever change that. We're a family now." Dr. Matthews watched the interaction with approval, making notes in her file. The healing process would be long and complex, but the foundation was their love, commitment, and the unshakable bond between two siblings who had protected each other when no one else would. As the afternoon sun painted the hospital room in warm light, Richard Bennett sat between his sleeping children, holding one small hand in each of his own. The past couldn't be changed, the years of separation, the pain, the betrayals, but the future stretched before them full of possibility. On the bedside table, beside the legal documents that would make them officially a family, lay Tommy's notebook, the evidence that had brought down Sarah Parker's empire of cruelty. But it was more than that now. It was a testament to a child's courage, to the power of truth, and to the unbreakable spirit of two siblings who had never stopped fighting for each other. Richard squeezed their hands gently, making a silent vow. His children would never know fear or loneliness again. They would grow up surrounded by love, security, and the knowledge that they were wanted, valued, and cherished. The healing could begin. The autumn wind rustled through the newly planted maple trees, lining the driveway of what had once been Hope Haven Orphanage. The building's grey facade had been transformed, its walls now warm cream-coloured with cheerful blue trim. Above the entrance, a new sign read, "The Bennett Children's Centre, a place of new beginnings." Richard stood at the entrance, surveying the changes 3 months of intensive renovation had brought. The former orphanage had been completely gutted and rebuilt from the inside out, the The dreaded basement had been filled in with concrete, exorcising the ghosts of its dark past. In its place, a new wing spread across the property, filled with sunlit classrooms, art studios, and play areas. Tommy and Emily stood beside their father, their hands clasped tightly together as they always were in moments of stress. Though both children were healing well, Tommy's physical injuries long since mended, Emily's nightmares becoming less frequent. Returning to this place required immense courage. But "Are you sure you want to do this?" Richard asked them gently. "We can wait if you're not ready." Tommy squared his shoulders, looking so much like his father in that moment. "The other kids need to see it's really different now. That it's safe." Emily nodded in agreement, clutching her ever-present teddy bear closer. Inside, the transformation was even more dramatic. The institutional corridors had been replaced by warm, welcoming spaces. The walls, once bare except for peeling paint, now displayed children's artwork and colorful murals. The former dormitories had been converted into comfortable family-style living units, each housing no more than 4 children under the care of a trained guardian. Mrs. Anderson, the new director Richard had personally selected, approached them with a warm smile. A former child psychologist with decades of experience in trauma recovery, she embodied everything Sarah Parker had: not genuine compassion, transparent operations, and a deep understanding of children's needs. "The first group of children arrives tomorrow," she informed them, consulting her tablet. 7 siblings we managed to keep together, 4 children from the city's emergency shelter." And she paused, looking at Tommy and Emily. "3 of your former Hope Haven friends who've been asking about you." Emily's face lit up. "Jamie, Lucy and Michael," she whispered hopefully. When Mrs. Anderson nodded, the little girl smiled, a real, unguarded smile that was becoming more frequent these days. They toured the facility together, Richard watching his children's reactions carefully. In the new dining hall, Tommy paused by the kitchen, remembering nights of hunger. But now the space was bright and welcoming, with round tables instead of long institutional ones, and a chef who specialized in nutritious children's meals. "Everyone eats together here," Mrs. Anderson explained. "Staff, children, visitors, we're creating a family atmosphere, not an institution." The library, Tommy's special project, had been stocked with thousands of books. He had helped select many of them himself, insisting on titles that would appeal to children of all ages and reading levels. A special corner was dedicated to Emily's favorite fairy tales, complete with comfortable reading nooks and soft pillows. The medical wing was staffed around the clock. No child would ever be denied care again. The education center offered individualized learning programs, recognizing that many of their residents had gaps in their schooling due to their circumstances. But perhaps the most significant change was the transparency. Large windows everywhere allowed natural light and clear sight lines. Security cameras monitored every public space, their feeds displayed openly in the reception area. Financial records were publicly audited, and a board of child welfare experts oversaw all operations. "Every week we'll have independent inspectors visit," Richard explained to his children. "And any child who feels unsafe can press these buttons." He indicated the emergency call systems installed throughout the building. Help will come immediately. In what had once been Sarah's office, now transformed into a cheerful counseling center, Emily suddenly stopped. "Dad," she asked, her voice small but steady, "can I leave my teddy bear here?" "For the new kids, so they know it's safe now." Richard knelt beside his daughter, his heart swelling with pride at her gesture. The teddy bear had been her constant companion since her rescue, a symbol of security in her newly safe world. That she felt secure enough to pass it on to another scared child spoke volumes about her healing. "That's a wonderful idea, sweetheart," he said softly. "Where would you like to put it?" Emily walked to a small table in the waiting area and carefully placed her bear in a sitting position. Here, she decided, so they can see it right away when they come in. Tommy reached for his sister's hand again, but this time his grip was supportive rather than protective. "Maybe we can come visit sometimes," he suggested. "Help the new kids feel safe like we do now." Mrs. Anderson smiled warmly. "We'd like that very much. Your experience and strength could help many children understand that there's hope after trauma." As they prepared to leave, Richard took one last look around. The Bennett Children's Center represented more than just the transformation of a building. It was a symbol of healing, of second chances, and of the power of love to overcome darkness. "Ready to go home?" he asked his children. Tommy and Emily nodded, both casting one final glance at the teddy bear keeping watch in the counseling center. They walked out together into the autumn sunshine, leaving behind the shadows of Hope Haven and stepping into the promise of a brighter future, not just for themselves, but for every child who would find sanctuary within these transformed walls. The east wing of Bennett Mansion, once a shrine to loss, buzzed with the energy of new life. Tommy and Emily's rooms had been decorated according to their own choices, a first for both children. Tommy's walls were lined with bookshelves, his desk positioned by a large window overlooking the garden. Emily's room was painted in soft pastels, with a handmade quilt on her bed and a dollhouse that Richard had found in storage, once meant for Emma. Mrs. Rosa, who had served the Bennett household for years, found herself smiling more often these days. The sound of children's laughter echoing through the previously silent halls brought warmth to the old mansion. She had taken on the role of grandmother figure, teaching Emily to bake cookies and listening to Tommy practice his reading aloud. One evening, as Richard passed Emily's room, he heard something that made him stop in his tracks: laughter. Real, unrestrained, childish laughter. Peering through the partially open door, he saw Emily and Tommy engaged in what appeared to be an elaborate pillow fort construction project, their faces alight with joy. "Dad," Tommy called out, spotting him. "Come help us. Emily says the fort needs structural support." Richard didn't hesitate, dropping to his knees to join his children. As they worked together, arranging blankets and positioning pillows, he marveled at how far they'd come. Just months ago, these same children had been trapped in a nightmare. Now, slowly but surely, they were learning to be children again. The therapy sessions with Dr. Matthews continued, but their nature had evolved. Individual sessions helped each child process their trauma in age-appropriate ways. Family sessions taught them all how to communicate, to trust, to build healthy relationships. Richard learned to be patient with their healing process, to understand that recovery wasn't linear. There were still difficult moments. Emily would sometimes wake screaming from nightmares, convinced Sarah was coming to take her away. Tommy struggled with guilt over the other children they'd left behind, even though most had been placed in loving homes through the Bennett Center's new adoption program. One particularly challenging evening, Richard found Tommy sitting alone in the garden, clutching his old notebook. "I keep thinking about the ones we couldn't save," he admitted quietly. "The ones Sarah sold before we stopped her." Richard sat beside his son, putting an arm around his shoulders. "The police are still working on finding them, thanks to your evidence. 3 more children were reunited with their families last week." Tommy leaned into his father's embrace, something that would have been unthinkable months ago. "Do you think they'll all be found?" "We won't stop until they are," Richard promised. "The Foundation has hired special investigators just for this purpose. Every child deserves to come home." Inside, Emily was having her own breakthrough moment with Mrs. Rosa. As they needed dough for bread, the little girl spoke about her time in the basement for the first time without crying. "I used to pretend I was baking with my mom," she confessed. "I didn't remember her, but I imagine she was nice like you." Mrs. Rosa wiped flour from Emily's cheek, her eyes glistening. "Your mother would be so proud of you, my angel. And now you have a papa who loves you very much." The children's education was carefully tailored to their needs. Private tutors helped them catch up on misschooling, while therapeutic art and music classes provided outlets for emotional expression. Tommy showed a remarkable aptitude for writing, channeling his experiences into stories that helped other trauma survivors. Emily discovered a talent for painting, her once dark world blooming with color on canvas. Richard made sure to be present for every milestone, no matter how small. He attended every therapy session, helped with homework, and never missed their new tradition of bedtime stories. The business empire he had once prioritized above all else took a backseat to his children's needs. The transformation wasn't just in the children. Richard found himself changing too, learning to open his heart again after years of guarding it against pain. The room that had been Emma's remained as a memorial, but it was no longer a shrine to grief. Instead, it became a place where they could talk about loss, about family, about healing. One night, as Richard tucked Emily into bed, she asked the question he'd been waiting for. "Daddy? Can I see a picture of Emma? Tommy says she was our sister too, kind of." Richard's heart swelled at being called Daddy. It had taken Emily months to feel secure enough to use the term. He retrieved a photograph from his wallet, showing it to her carefully. "This was Emma. She would have loved being your big sister." Emily studied the photo thoughtfully. "She has your smile, like Tommy does." "Yes," Richard agreed softly, "and you have her kind heart." Later that night, Richard stood in his study, looking at the family photos on his desk. Alongside the old pictures of Grace and Emma, new ones had appeared: Tommy and Emily at the beach, both children with Mrs. Rosa in the kitchen, the three of them together at the Bennett Center's opening. Different pieces of his heart, past and present, learning to coexist. The path to healing wasn't easy or straight, but they were walking it together. Each day brought new challenges, new victories, new moments of joy and growth. The darkness of their past hadn't disappeared, but it was being steadily overcome by the light of love, trust, and family. In the quiet of the evening, Richard could hear Tommy reading to Emily in her room, their voices carrying the simple comfort of siblings sharing a story. The sound reminded him that sometimes the greatest healing comes not from forgetting the past, but from building a future strong enough to bear its weight. St. Michael's Cathedral stood majestic in the late afternoon sun, its stained glass windows casting prismatic patterns across rows of elegantly dressed guests. The air was heavy with the scent of white roses and anticipation. Sarah Parker stood in the bridal suite, a vision in designer white lace, her reflection in the full-length mirror showing nothing of the turmoil beneath her perfect exterior. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her veil, knowing that in less than an hour she would become Mrs. Richard Bennett. Everything she had worked for, schemed for, killed for, was within reach. The empire she had built on the broken spirits of children would be legitimized by marriage to one of the city's most respected philanthropists. But something was wrong. The notebook and recordings were missing from her office safe. Tommy Wilson had disappeared from the basement. The carefully constructed walls of her deception were showing hairline cracks, threatening to shatter her perfectly planned future. 10 minutes, MS. Parker called the wedding coordinator through the door. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had come too far to falter now. Whatever that troublesome boy had taken, whatever he thought he knew, she would handle it. She always had. The wedding march began to play, its solemn notes echoing through the cathedral's vast space. Sarah took her position at the great wooden doors, her bouquet clutched in white-knuckled hands. The doors swung open, and she began her carefully choreographed walk down the aisle. Richard stood at the altar, silver hair catching the light, his kind face beaming with genuine love and trust. The sight almost made Sarah falter, a moment of genuine regret for what she was about to do to this man who had shown her nothing but kindness. Almost. The priest began the ceremony, his words about love and trust ringing hollow in Sarah's ears. She maintained her mask of devoted bride, letting tears of supposed joy slip down her cheeks at appropriate moments. The gathered guests sighed at the romantic scene, the beautiful young humanitarian marrying the wealthy widower. It was perfect, too perfect. The heavy doors at the back of the church suddenly burst open with a thunderous crack. Tommy Wilson stood in the doorway, clutching a manila envelope and a cassette tape to his chest. His clothes were torn, his feet bare and muddy, but his eyes blazed with determination. "Stop," his young voice carried clearly through the stunned silence. "You can't marry her, Mr. Bennett. She's not who you think she is." Sarah's fingers tightened around her bouquet, thorns pricking through her lace gloves. "Security," she hissed, but Tommy was already running down the aisle, scattering his evidence like autumn leaves. "She steals from the orphanage," he shouted. "She hurts us. She locks kids in the basement. It's all here, the proof, the money, everything." Richard stood frozen, his eyes moving between his bride and the desperate child. The cassette tape Tommy held up seemed to take on an almost physical weight in the suddenly thick air. "Play it," Tommy pleaded. "Listen to what she says when she thinks nobody's watching." Sarah lunged for the tape, her perfect composure cracking. The movement sent her bouquet flying, white roses scattering across the altar steps like fallen stars. In that instant, her mask slipped, revealing something dark and terrifying beneath the beautiful surface. A church deacon had already connected the tape player to the sound system. Sarah's own voice, cold and calculating, filled the sacred space. "Once we're married, half of everything he owns becomes mine. The orphanage, the donations, the children, they're just means to an end, and those who know too much." The color drained from Richard's face as recording after recording played. Conversations about embezzled funds, plans for after the wedding, cruel discussions about the children's treatment. Each revelation struck like a physical blow. "Stop," Sarah commanded, her voice no longer sweet but sharp with panic. "This is ridiculous. You can't believe the ravings of a troubled child over your fiancé." But Tommy wasn't finished. "Tell them about Emily," he demanded. "Tell them about my sister and the others in the basement. Tell them what you really do with the children nobody wants." The gathered guests began to murmur, shock and horror spreading through the crowd like ripples in a poisoned pond. Sarah's carefully constructed world was crumbling around her, each revelation another crack in her perfect facade. She made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation, turning to Richard with tears streaming down her face. "Darling, please," she pleaded, "don't let this troubled child destroy our special day. Everything I did for us." But Richard had already stepped away from her, his face transformed by understanding and revulsion. He moved to stand beside Tommy, placing a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "The police are already on their way," he said quietly. "They're at Hope Haven right now, freeing the children in the basement. It's over, Sarah." The sound of sirens in the distance confirmed his words. Sarah's legs gave way, and she collapsed in a heap of white lace at the foot of the altar. The perfect bride was gone, leaving only the monster beneath exposed for all to see. As the police entered the cathedral, Tommy turned to Richard, his small face earnest. "I'm sorry I ruined your wedding," he whispered. Richard knelt beside the boy who had dared to tell the truth no matter the cost. "You didn't ruin anything," Sonny replied. "You saved me. You saved me. You saved all of us." The guests watched in stunned silence as Sarah Parker, the beloved humanitarian, was led away in handcuffs, her wedding dress dragging on the cathedral floor. The white roses that had decorated the church now lay scattered and broken, like the pieces of the life she had almost stolen. The truth had finally prevailed, but as Tommy watched his former tormentor being led away, he knew this was just the beginning. There were still children to save, wounds to heal, and a long path to justice ahead. But for now, standing in the cathedral with Richard's protective hand on his shoulder, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. The hours following Sarah's arrest unfolded in a blur of police sirens, camera flashes, and shocked whispers. As the guests filed out of St. Michael's Cathedral, their faces a mixture of horror and disbelief, Richard stood in the sacristy with Tommy, waiting for news from Hope Haven. His phone rang Detective Hayes, leading the raid on the orphanage. "Mr. Bennett, we found them. All of them." Her voice cracked slightly. "There were 17 children in the basement, including Tommy's sister. They're being transported to Metropolitan Hospital now." Richard watched as Tommy's face transformed at the mention of his sister. The boy who had shown such incredible courage now looked like what he truly was, a scared child desperate to reunite with his sibling. "Can we?" Tommy started to ask, his voice trembling. "We're going right now," Richard assured him, already heading for the door. As they rushed to his car, reporters swarmed around them, shouting questions about Sarah, about the orphanage, about the shocking revelations at the wedding. "Mr. Bennett, did you know about your fiancé's activities?" "Tommy Wilson, how did you discover the truth? What about the missing children?" Richard shielded Tommy from the cameras, hurrying him into the car. As they pulled away from the cathedral, he could see Sarah being led to a police vehicle in her wedding dress, the white lace now sullied and torn, a fitting metaphor for the corruption beneath her beautiful facade. At Metropolitan Hospital, chaos reigned. The emergency department was overwhelmed with children requiring immediate medical attention. Some bore visible signs of abuse, bruises, malnutrition, fear etched into their young faces. Others showed deeper, less visible wounds that would take far longer to heal. Tommy broke away from Richard's side the moment he spotted Emily. His sister sat on an examination table, looking tiny and fragile in a hospital gown, but her face lit up when she saw her brother. The siblings collided in a tearful embrace, 7 months of separation dissolving in a moment of pure relief. Richard stood back, watching the reunion with tears in his eyes. Emily looked so much like the photograph in Tommy's notebook, the same dark eyes, the same determined set to her chin, despite her fear. As he observed their interaction, he noticed something else, subtle similarities between the children and himself. The way Tommy's jaw clenched when he was trying to be brave, the arch of Emily's eyebrows when she was concerned. Dr. Matthews, the hospital's child psychologist, approached him with a thick file. "Mr. Bennett," she began carefully, "there's something you need to see." She opened the file to reveal a DNA test, one that Sarah had ordered months ago but kept hidden. The results confirmed what his heart had already begun to suspect. Tommy and Emily weren't just any children from the orphanage, they were his children, born to a woman he'd had a brief relationship with during his darkest days after losing his wife and daughter. Sarah had known all along, using his own children as pawns in her cruel game. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. All those months, his own children had been suffering under Sarah's care, while he lavished her with attention and praise. The guilt was overwhelming, but there would be time for that later. Right now, his children needed him. Detective Hayes arrived with more devastating news. A search of Sarah's office had uncovered records of dozens of children who had been sold to wealthy clients over the years. The trafficking network stretched across multiple countries, involving some of society's most prominent figures. She kept meticulous records, the detective explained, spreading photographs across a conference room table. Names, dates, amounts paid, everything we need to track these children down. But it's going to take time. Richard looked at the photographs, bright young faces that had been treated as commodities. Each one represented a family torn apart, a childhood stolen. "Whatever resources you need," he stated firmly. "The Bennett Foundation will fund the search for every single child." Back in the emergency department, Tommy had fallen asleep on a chair next to Emily's bed, exhausted from the day's events. Emily was awake but quiet, watching Richard with a mixture of hope and wariness that broke his heart. "Are you really our dad?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. But Richard moved closer, careful not to startle her. "Yes, sweetheart, I am. And I'm so sorry I didn't know sooner. So sorry I couldn't protect you both." Emily studied his face for a long moment, perhaps looking for traces of herself in his features. "Tommy always said someone would save us," she said finally. "He said if we were brave and told the truth, The bad people wouldn't win. "Your brother is the bravest person I've ever met," Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of you are, and I promise you no one will ever hurt you again." As night fell over the hospital, Richard sat between his sleeping children, his mind reeling from the day's events. The wedding that should have been his happiest day had turned into an exposition of evil, but it had also reunited him with the children he hadn't known he had lost. Outside the hospital room, the world was exploding with news of Sarah Parker's crimes. But inside, in the quiet space between heartbeats, a new family was beginning to form from the ashes of betrayal. It wouldn't be easy. There were wounds to heal, trust to build, and years of lost time to mourn. But as Richard watched his children sleep, he knew that this was the real love story, not the false romance he had planned to celebrate that day, but the profound, unshakable love of a father for his children. The wedding flowers might have wilted, the carefully planned ceremony ruined, but something far more precious had bloomed in its place: the truth, and with it, the chance for healing, justice, and real love to finally prevail. Detective Laura Hayes stood before the evidence board in the precinct, studying the web of connections that had emerged from Sarah Parker's files. Photos, documents, and red strings created a complex pattern of criminality that stretched back decades. At the center was a single photograph: Sarah Parker as a child, standing in front of Hope Haven Orphanage 20 years ago. "We found something else," her partner announced, dropping a thick file on her desk. "Sarah Parker isn't her real name. She was born Sarah Wilson. And here's the kicker: she's Tommy and Emily's aunt." The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. DNA tests confirmed Sarah was the sister of the children's mother, Catherine Wilson, who had died under mysterious circumstances shortly after Emily's birth. The same records revealed something even more disturbing: Catherine had been trying to expose corruption at Hope Haven before her death. In the interrogation room, Sarah sat in her now-stained wedding dress, her carefully constructed facade crumbling as Detective Hayes laid out the evidence. "Your own sister," the detective said quietly. "You knew all along those were your sister's children." Catherine was weak, Sarah spat, her voice bitter. She wanted to save the children, expose the truth. She didn't understand that the system only works if someone's willing to be strong enough to control it. The investigation uncovered a pattern of systematic abuse spanning years. Sarah had used Hope Haven as a front for multiple criminal enterprises: embezzlement, money laundering, and child trafficking. The children who disappeared into the basement were sold to wealthy clients worldwide, their identities erased and replaced with carefully crafted cover stories. Richard Bennett was devastated to learn how close he had come to marrying a woman who had tortured his own children, the children he hadn't known existed. The DNA test results lay heavy on his desk as he read through Catherine's old journals, discovered in a hidden compartment in Sarah's office. The journals told a heartbreaking story. Catherine had discovered she was pregnant with Tommy shortly after her brief relationship with Richard, but by then he had withdrawn from the world, lost in grief over his first family. She had tried to contact him multiple times, but Sarah, already working at Hope Haven, had intercepted the letters. When Catherine had begun gathering evidence of Sarah's crimes, her sister had arranged an accident. Catherine survived long enough to give birth to Emily, but died shortly after, leaving her children at the mercy of the system and unknowingly in the clutches of their aunt. Tommy and Emily listened silently as Richard explained their mother's story, sitting in the safety of what was now their home. The truth was painful, but it was also freeing. They weren't unwanted children. They had been loved, sought after, protected until the very end by a mother who had died trying to save them. "Your mother was incredibly brave," Richard told them, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like both of you." Emily clutched the photo of their mother that had been found in Catherine's journal. "She looks like Tommy when she smiles," she observed quietly. She was trying to find Dad, Tommy added, understanding now why Sarah had been so desperate to keep them apart. She never stopped trying to tell him about us. The investigation expanded, reaching into the highest levels of society. Prominent figures were arrested, their carefully maintained reputations shattered by evidence of their involvement in Sarah's trafficking network. Hope Haven's financial records revealed millions in embezzled funds, laundered through a complex web of charitable foundations. But amidst the darkness there was hope. Each new piece of evidence helped locate another missing child, another family torn apart by Sarah's cruelty. The Bennett Foundation established a special unit dedicated to finding and reuniting these families, providing whatever support they needed to heal. Sarah Parker, or Sarah Wilson, would spend the rest of her life in prison, her crimes too numerous and too heinous for any chance of parole. But even in custody, she provided one final service to justice. Her detailed records helped authorities dismantle similar trafficking operations across the country. For Richard, Tommy, and Emily, the truth brought both pain and healing. They grieved for Catherine, for the years of separation, for the suffering they had endured. But they also found strength in their shared history, in the knowledge that they had always been meant to be a family. "Your mother would be so proud of you both," Richard told his children one evening, as they sat together looking through Catherine's journals. "She never gave up fighting for what was right, just like you never gave up fighting for the truth." Tommy wrapped his arm around his sister protectively, a habit he would probably never lose. "Do you think she knows? That we found each other? That we're safe now?" Richard pulled both children close, his heart full of love and gratitude for the family he had almost lost. "I believe she knows," he said softly, "and I believe she helped guide us back together." The truth had been painful, but it had also been the key to their healing. From the ashes of Sarah's betrayal, a stronger family had emerged, one built on love, truth, and the unshakable bonds of both blood and choice. The attack came without warning in the dead of night. 3 months after Sarah's arrest, as the Bennett household slept peacefully, dark figures slipped through the mansion's security systems with practiced ease. They moved with purpose, heading directly for the east wing where Tommy and Emily slept. Tommy woke to the sound of muffled footsteps in the hallway. Years of survival instincts kicked in immediately. He slipped from his bed and crept to Emily's room, finding his sister already awake, eyes wide with fear. "Under the bed," he whispered, helping her into the hiding spot they had practiced during their therapy sessions. "Remember the panic button?" Emily nodded, clutching the emergency alert device Richard had installed in every room. Tommy had just managed to slide the toy chest in front of her hiding spot when the door burst open. 2 men in black tactical gear entered, their movements precise and professional. "Got one," the first man said, grabbing Tommy before he could react. "Where's the girl?" Tommy struggled fiercely, but his small body was no match for his captors. Still, he managed to knock over a lamp, the crash echoing through the mansion. "Emily, press it," he shouted before a hand clamped over his mouth. Emily's trembling finger found the panic button, sending alarms blaring through the house. The sound of breaking glass and running footsteps filled the air as more intruders fled with Tommy. Richard burst into the room seconds later, his face pale with terror. "Emily," he called out, frantically searching until he found her under the bed. "Where's your brother?" They took him, Emily sobbed, launching herself into her father's arms. "They said Sarah sent them. They said if you want to see Tommy alive, you have to drop all the charges." The police arrived within minutes, but the kidnappers had vanished into the night. Detective Hayes coordinated an immediate search, but the perpetrators had left no traces. They were professionals, hired by what remained of Sarah's network. Hours passed in agonizing slowness. Richard paced the living room, his phone clutched in his hand, waiting for the ransom call. Emily sat curled in Mrs. Rosa's lap, refusing to sleep, her eyes fixed on the door, as if willing her brother to walk through it. When the call finally came, it wasn't a ransom demand. Instead, Sarah's cold voice filled the speaker. "Hello, Richard. Missing something?" If you heard him, Richard's voice shook with rage and fear. "That depends entirely on you," Sarah replied. "Drop the charges. All of them. Recant your testimony. Sign over control of the Bennett Foundation to my associates. Do this and Tommy lives." Refuse. The sound of Tommy crying out in pain made Richard's blood run cold. "You have 1 hour to comply," Sarah continued. "And Richard, don't bother trying to trace this call. We're not amateurs." The next 50 minutes were a blur of activity. Detective Hayes set up a trace despite Sarah's warning. Richard's security team analyzed the background sounds from the call, searching for clues. Emily sat with the police sketch artist, describing every detail she could remember about the kidnappers. With 10 minutes remaining, they had nothing. No leads, no location, no way to reach Tommy. Richard stood by the window, watching dawn break over the city, feeling more helpless than he had since losing his first family. Dad, Emily's small voice broke through his despair. "Remember what Tommy told us about the basement? About how he could hear the subway trains?" Richard's head snapped up. During their therapy sessions, Tommy had described how he tracked time in Hope Heaven's basement by counting the subway trains that passed nearby. The vibrations had been his way of staying sane in the darkness. "Detective," Richard called out. "The old Hope Haven building, is there a subway line that runs near it?" "The blue line," Detective Hayes confirmed, already reaching for her radio. "And there's a maintenance tunnel that connects to the basement. We swept it during the initial investigation, but..." "They would know about it," Richard finished. "Sarah's people used it for years to move children in and out unseen." Within minutes, a tactical team was assembled. Richard insisted on going with them, despite the detectives' protests. As they approached the abandoned orphanage, they could hear the rumble of a subway train passing below. The building stood dark and empty, condemned after Sarah's arrest. But as they drew closer, a faint light flickered in one of the basement windows. Tommy was down there, Richard knew with certainty, and this time he would not fail to protect his son. The rescue operation was about to begin, but none of them realized that the true horror was yet to come. Sarah had one final, devastating card to play. The tactical team moved silently through the maintenance tunnel, their footsteps masked by the rumble of passing trains. Richard's heart pounded as he followed behind them, protected by a bulletproof vest that felt inadequate against the magnitude of his fear. Detective Hayes had insisted he stay back, but nothing could have kept him from this rescue attempt. The tunnel opened into Hope Heaven's basement, a place of nightmares now made real again. Emergency lights cast sickly shadows across the walls, and the air was thick with the musty scent of abandonment. But there was something else, something that made the tactical team leader raise his hand in warning: the sharp, chemical smell of gasoline. "Look what you made me do," Richard Sarah's voice echoed through the basement's darkness. She stood at the far end of the room, looking deranged in her prison jumpsuit. Behind her, Tommy was tied to a support pillar, conscious but clearly terrified. Gas cans were scattered around him, their contents already soaking into the concrete floor. "One more step," Sarah called out, holding up a lighter, "and everything burns." How fitting that it should end here, where it all began. Richard stepped forward, ignoring the tactical team's attempts to hold him back. "Sarah, please. He's just a child." "He's your child," she spat, her voice bitter with hatred. "Your precious heir, hidden from you all these years while I played the perfect fiancé. Did you ever wonder why he looked so familiar? Why he had your eyes, your stubborn chin?" The tactical team was spreading out, looking for clear shots, but Sarah's position behind Tommy made it impossible. One spark from the lighter, and the entire basement would become an inferno. "You want to know the truth?" Richard Sarah's laugh was hollow, echoing off the damp walls. "I knew who he was the moment Catherine brought him to Hope Haven. Your son, born of that brief affair you probably don't even remember. But you didn't deserve him. You, with your perfect life, your wealth, your reputation, you didn't deserve any of it. Tommy's eyes met Richard's across the room, and in that moment father and son shared a silent understanding. Tommy began counting under his breath, timing the passing trains just as he had during his captivity. Sarah Richard took another careful step forward, keeping her attention focused on him. Whatever I did to hurt you, whatever pain I caused, punish me. Not Tommy. Not any more children. Hurt me, Sarah's voice rose hysterically. You promised to help me, remember? The bright young orphan with so much potential. You were going to ensure I got an education opportunities. But then your precious wife and daughter died, and you forgot all about me. Left me to rot in that system. The pieces finally clicked into place. Sarah's obsession with him, her elaborate scheme to take over his life. She had been one of the countless children he had promised to help through Hope Haven before grief had consumed him and made him abandon his philanthropic work. 3, Tommy whispered, still counting train intervals. 2. I'm sorry, Richard said, and for the first time, Sarah's hand holding the lighter trembled. I failed you. I failed so many children. But this isn't the way, Sarah. It's not too late to do the right thing. 1, Tommy finished, just as the next train rumbled beneath them. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As the vibrations shook the basement, Tommy threw himself sideways, using the rope's slack to knock Sarah off balance. The lighter flew from her hand, arsing through the air like a deadly star. Richard moved without thinking, diving forward to catch the lighter before it could hit the gasoline-soaked floor. The tactical team swarmed in, subduing Sarah as she screamed in incoherent rage. But Dad, Tommy's cry broke through the chaos. Richard scrambled to his son, hands shaking as he untied the ropes. The moment Tommy was free, he threw himself into his father's arms, both of them trembling with relief and residual fear. I knew you'd come, Tommy whispered into Richard's shoulder. I counted the trains just like before. I knew you'd understand. But as they held each other in that dark basement, neither father nor son noticed Sarah managing to slip one hand free, reaching for something hidden in her jumpsuit. The real nightmare was about to begin, and this time, not everyone would make it out alive. The glint of metal in Sarah's hand caught Detective Hayes' eye a split second too late. Gun, she shouted. But Sarah had already broken free from her distracted guard, the small weapon she had concealed now aimed directly at Tommy and Richard. If I can't have the life I deserve, Sarah snarled, her finger tightening on the trigger, then neither can you. Time seemed to slow down as multiple events happened simultaneously. The tactical team raised their weapons, but Sarah's position near the gasoline made shooting too risky. Richard moved to shield Tommy with his body, knowing he wouldn't be fast enough. And through the basement door, a small figure darted into the room. Emily, who had followed the rescue team against all instructions, saw the gun pointing at her family and acted on pure instinct. She ran straight at Sarah, her small body colliding with their tormentor's legs just as the gun went off. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. For a moment nobody moved. Then Sarah crumpled to the ground, the bullet having ricocheted off a metal pipe and struck her instead of its intended targets. Emily lay motionless beside her. But Emily, the synchronized screams of father and brother shattered the frozen tableau. Richard reached his daughter first, gathering her small body in his arms. Blood stained her nightgown, but she was breathing. The bullet had only grazed her shoulder. I couldn't let her hurt Tommy again, Emily whispered, her voice weak but determined. We promised to protect each other. The tactical team secured Sarah, who was alive but seriously wounded. As medics rushed in to treat both casualties, Detective Hayes knelt beside the fallen woman. It's over, Sarah, she said firmly. The only person you've destroyed is yourself. In the ambulance, Richard held both his children close, unwilling to let either out of his sight. Tommy hadn't stopped holding his sister's hand, his face streaked with tears of guilt and relief. Emily, despite the pain of her wound, kept reassuring them both that she was okay. "I heard everything on Dad's phone," she explained as paramedics treated her injury. "I couldn't stay home knowing Tommy was in danger. We're family, we stick together." At the hospital, as doctors examined Emily and treated her wound, Richard and Tommy sat in the waiting room, still processing the night's events. "She could have died," Tommy said quietly, his voice shaking. "Emily could have died because of me." Richard pulled his son close. "No, Tommy. Emily could have died because of Sarah's choices, not yours. You both showed incredible bravery tonight, but please, please promise me you'll never put yourselves in danger like that again. I can't lose either of you." The news about Sarah came later that night. The bullet had caused more damage than initially thought, and despite the surgeon's best efforts, she didn't survive. Her last words, according to the attending nurse, were a whispered, "I'm sorry." Detective Hayes brought them the final piece of evidence found in Sarah's possession, a crumpled photograph showing her as a young girl, standing next to Richard at a Hope Haven charity event. On the back was written in childish handwriting the day someone promised to save me. Richard stared at the photograph for a long time, remembering that day, remembering the bright young girl who had reminded him so much of his lost daughter. If he had kept his promise then, if he hadn't let his grief consume him, how many lives might have been different? But looking at Tommy and Emily, now sleeping peacefully in Emily's hospital room, he knew he couldn't change the past. He could only ensure that no other child would be forgotten or abandoned as Sarah had been. The night's events made headlines across the city. Tragic end to Hope Haven saga. Former orphan's revenge plot foils itself. Young girl's bravery saves family. But for the Bennetts, the real story wasn't in the newspapers. It was in the quiet moments of healing that followed, in Emily's proud showing of her battle scar, in Tommy's fierce protectiveness of his sister, in the way they both slept better knowing Sarah could never hurt them again. The basement of Hope Haven would later be filled with concrete, the building itself torn down to make way for a new children's center. But the lessons learned there about courage, sacrifice, and the devastating cost of broken promises would never be forgotten. In the weeks following Sarah's death, Detective Hayes continued to unravel the complex web of secrets surrounding Hope Haven. Each new discovery painted a more devastating picture of how deep the corruption had spread and how many lives had been affected. The breakthrough came when they found Sarah's private journals hidden in a safety deposit box that was opened after her death. The writings revealed a tragic descent from a hopeful child to a hardened criminal, but they also contained something unexpected, a complete record of every child who had passed through Hope Haven's doors. Mr. Bennett, Detective Hayes called one evening, her voice unusually gentle. "We found something you need to see." She spread the journal entries across his desk, pointing to a specific date 20 years ago. "There's this entry. It's about your daughter Emma." Richard's hands trembled as he read the words. According to Sarah's journal, the car accident that had supposedly killed his wife Grace and daughter Emma had been no accident at all. It had been orchestrated by the same criminal network that would later use Hope Haven for trafficking, a network that had targeted Richard's philanthropy as a potential cover for their operations. But the most shocking revelation was that Emma hadn't died in the crash. Barely alive, she had been taken by the criminals and eventually sent overseas through their trafficking network. Sarah, then a teenage resident at Hope Haven, had witnessed everything but kept silent, using the information to later infiltrate and eventually control the same criminal organization. "There's more," Detective Hayes continued, pulling out another document. "We found records of where she was sent. Mr. Bennett, Emma might still be alive." The news hit Richard like a physical blow. For 20 years he had mourned his daughter, visited an empty grave, carried the weight of guilt for not being there that night. Now the possibility that she might be alive somewhere, that she had endured unimaginable horrors while he believed her dead, was almost too much to bear. Tommy and Emily found him in his study later that night, still staring at the journals. They had grown attuned to their father's emotions over the months since their reunion, and they knew immediately that something was wrong. "Dad," Tommy approached cautiously. What did the detective find? Richard looked at his children, these two miraculous survivors who had taught him so much about courage and resilience, and knew they deserved the truth. Carefully, he explained about Emma, about the accident that wasn't an accident, about the possibility that somewhere in the world they had a sister they had never met. Emily climbed into her father's lap, her small hand wiping away tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. "Then we have to find her," she said simply, with the straightforward determination of a child. "Like you found us." Tommy nodded in agreement, already reaching for his notebook, the same one that had helped expose Sarah's crimes. "We can make a plan," he suggested. "Like before, write down everything we know and figure out what to do next." Richard pulled both children close, drawing strength from their unwavering support. "It won't be easy," he warned them. "She might be anywhere in the world. And even if we find her, she might not want to be found." "But we have to try," Tommy insisted. "She's family. And you always say family never gives up on each other." Detective Hayes had already put her best team on the search, coordinating with international agencies and organizations that specialized in finding trafficking victims. The Bennett Foundation's resources were fully committed to the effort, creating a global network of investigators and advocates all working toward one goal: finding Emma Bennett. As Richard tucked his children into bed that night, both insisting on sleeping in the same room whenever big news broke, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years: hope. Not just the desperate hope of a grieving father, but the solid, grounded hope that came from having a purpose and a plan. "Tell us about her," Emily requested sleepily. "About Emma." Richard sat on the edge of the bed, his heart full of memories he had kept locked away for so long. "She was so bright," he began softly. "Always curious, always asking questions. Like you, Tommy, and she had the biggest heart, always wanting to help others. Like you, Emily." As he shared stories about Emma with the siblings she had never met, Richard silently renewed the vow he had made when he first discovered Tommy and Emily were his children. He would let nothing stop him from bringing his family together. This time, all of his children would come home. The global search for Emma Bennett began in earnest. Richard transformed his home office into a command center, walls covered with maps, timelines, and possible leads. Tommy and Emily had their own corner, where they kept a detailed journal of every new piece of information, much like Tommy's notebook that had exposed Sarah's crimes. The first breakthrough came from an unlikely source. One of Sarah's former associates, hoping for leniency, revealed a network of safe houses across Europe where trafficking victims had been hidden. Detective Hayes coordinated with Interpol, methodically investigating each location. Months passed. Dead ends multiplied. But then, in a small town outside of Florence, Italy, they found something promising: school records for a girl matching Emma's age and description, enrolled 20 years ago under the name Emma Parker. "Parker," Richard whispered, studying the grainy school photograph. Sarah's chosen surname. She was marking her territory even then. The Italian records led to Switzerland, then France, creating a trail of a young girl passed between adoptive families who were actually members of the trafficking network. Each new discovery was both heartbreaking and hopeful evidence that Emma had survived, had fought, had somehow maintained her identity through years of trauma. Tommy and Emily threw themselves into learning Italian, convinced they would need it when they found their sister. They practiced with each other during meals, filling the once silent mansion with stumbling phrases and determined repetition. "Emma would be 30 now," Emily observed one evening, studying the age progression photos the investigators had created. "Do you think she remembers her real name? Her real family?" The question haunted Richard. The Emma he had lost was a bright, loving 5-year-old. The woman they were searching for had endured decades of unimaginable experiences. Would she want to be found? Would she even believe them if they did find her? The latest lead took them to a women's shelter in Paris that specialized in helping trafficking survivors. The director, Madame Rousseau, remembered Emma clearly. "She stayed with us for almost a year," she explained via video call. Such strength in that one. "She helped other girls escape, even after she left us. We called her Le Petit Ange Gardien, the little guardian angel." Richard's heart swelled with pride and pain. Even after everything she had endured, Emma had maintained the compassionate spirit she had shown as a child. She had transformed her trauma into a mission to help others, just as Tommy had used his experiences to expose Hope Heaven's corruption. The shelter's records provided a new name. Emma had left Paris 5 years ago, calling herself Emma Grace. She had taken her mother's name, perhaps as a way to hold on to her true identity. The trail led to Montreal, where Emma Grace had established a small foundation helping trafficking survivors rebuild their lives. "Look at this," Tommy exclaimed one morning, pointing to his computer screen. He had been researching Emma's foundation and found a recent interview. The woman in the video had Richard's eyes and Grace's gentle smile, though her face carried the shadows of her past. "We have to be careful," Detective Hayes cautioned during their next strategy meeting. "Emma's work with trafficking survivors means she's still at risk from remaining members of the network. And after everything she's been through, a direct approach could be traumatic." They decided to reach out through Madame Rousseau, who had maintained occasional contact with Emma over the years. The director would share their information gently, allowing Emma to decide if she wanted to connect with her past. The waiting was excruciating. Richard threw himself into expanding the Bennett Children's Center, channeling his anxiety into helping other families heal and reunite. Tommy and Emily continued their Italian lessons, now adding French to their studies, preparing for a reunion they prayed would come. Then, on a quiet Sunday morning, an email arrived from Montreal. Richard gathered his children before opening it, all three holding hands as they read the message together. "Dear Mr. Bennett, for 25 years I've carried a memory of a father who loved books and always had time for one more bedtime story. I've held on to a mother's smile and the sound of her laugh. I never forgot my real name or where I came from. Madame Rousseau told me about Tommy and Emily, about what happened at Hope Haven, about Sarah. I've watched the interview videos, seen the news reports. I've spent the past week looking at photos of my siblings and wondering if I deserve to be part of their brave, beautiful story. I'm not the same little girl you lost, but if you're willing, I'd like to try to find my way home. With hope. Emma Grace Bennett." Montreal's Pierre-Elliott Trudeau International Airport buzzed with typical morning activity, but for the Bennett family standing in the international arrivals area, time seemed to stand still. Richard clutched a small bouquet of daisies, Emma's favorite flower, as a child. Tommy and Emily held a handmade sign that read "Welcome Home, Emma" in careful letters decorated with Italian and French flags. They had exchanged several emails and video calls over the past month, but nothing could fully prepare them for this moment. Richard's heart pounded as each new passenger emerged through the sliding doors. Then suddenly there she was. Emma Grace Bennett stood frozen at the threshold, her carry-on bag slipping from her shoulder. At 30, she had Grace's delicate features and Richard's determined jaw. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a pendant the same one Grace had placed around her neck on her 5th birthday, somehow preserved through all these years. Emily moved first, breaking away from Tommy's hand and running forward. She stopped a few feet from Emma, suddenly shy. "I learned to say welcome home in Italian," she announced softly. "Bentornata a casa." Emma knelt down to Emily's level, tears streaming down her face. "Gracie, sorellina," she replied. "Little sister." The two stared at each other for a moment before Emma opened her arms and Emily flew into them. Tommy approached more cautiously, his protective instincts warring with his hope. but when Emma looked up at him, he saw the same strength that had helped him survive Hope Haven, the determination to protect others, to turn pain into purpose. "You saved them," Emma said, standing with Emily still in her arms. "You were so brave, little brother, just like Dad always taught us to be." Richard hadn't moved, couldn't move. His eldest daughter, his first lost child, was standing before him, alive and whole and so incredibly strong. When Emma's eyes met his, they were filled with 25 years of unshed tears. "But Daddy," she whispered, and suddenly she was 5 years old again, running to him after a nightmare. Richard caught her as she fell into his arms, Emily still clinging to her side, Tommy joining the embrace. They stood there in the middle of the airport, a family fractured by evil but made whole again by love and courage. Later, at the hotel where Emma was staying until she felt ready to return to the mansion, they shared their stories. Emma spoke of the families who had hidden her, some cruel, some kind. She told them about Madame Rousseau and the shelter in Paris where she had finally found her voice and her mission. "I never stopped looking for ways to help other girls escape," she explained. "It was my way of fighting back, of keeping hope alive. And every time I helped someone, I imagined Dad was out there somewhere, still proud of me." Tommy and Emily shared their own stories, the horrors of Hope Haven, but also the triumph of exposing Sarah's crimes and finding their way to their father. Emma listened with tears and pride, her hands constantly reaching out to touch her siblings, as if reassuring herself they were real. "When I saw the news about Hope Haven," she said, "I recognized Sarah immediately. She was there the night of the crash, watching from the shadows. I tried to call out, but they drugged me before I could scream. For years, I thought she might have been a nightmare my mind created." Richard sat quietly, absorbing every detail of his daughter's face, noting the similarities between his 3 children, Tommy's determined spirit, Emily's compassionate heart, and Emma's resilient strength. They were all survivors, all warriors in their own way. "I know it won't be easy," Emma said as evening approached. "We've all been through so much, changed so much, but if you're willing to try..." "We're family," Emily declared firmly, in the simple, absolute way of children. "Family means nobody gets left behind." "Or forgotten," Tommy added, reaching for his sister's hand. Richard looked at his 3 children, the daughter he had mourned for 25 years, the son who had exposed a criminal empire with a notebook and courage, and the little girl who had rushed into danger to save her family. They were all miracles, all precious beyond measure. "Welcome home, sweetheart," he said softly to Emma. "We have all the time in the world to learn each other again." Outside the hotel window, Montreal's lights twinkled like stars, promising new beginnings and healing for the family that had refused to be broken by darkness. 1 year after Emma's return, the Bennett mansion underwent its final transformation. The East Wing, once a shrine to loss, now echoed with the sounds of 3 children healing, growing, and learning to be a family. Emma had finally moved in, bringing with her 2 decades of experience helping trafficking survivors and a determination to continue her mission from her new home. The Bennett Children's Center had expanded, incorporating Emma's expertise to create specialized programs for trauma recovery. Tommy and Emily were regular visitors, sharing their own experiences to help other children find their voices. The basement that had once housed Sarah's crimes was now a sunlit art therapy studio, where young survivors could express their pain and hopes through creativity. Richard watched his family bloom with a joy he had never thought possible again. Emma had established a local branch of her Montreal Foundation, working alongside the center to provide comprehensive support for trafficking survivors. Tommy, now 11, had started writing a book about his experiences, hoping to help other children understand they weren't alone. Emily's nightmares had largely subsided, replaced by dreams of becoming a child psychologist like Dr. Matthews. Family dinner had become a sacred ritual, all 4 Bennetts gathering each evening to share their days. They spoke a mixture of English, Italian, and French, Emma teaching her siblings the languages she had learned during her years abroad. The conversations often turned serious, addressing their shared trauma and healing. But there was laughter too, growing stronger and more frequent with each passing day. Dad, Emma said one evening, as they sat in the garden watching Tommy teach Emily to play chess, "I found something in my old files that you should see." She handed him a worn photograph, Grace, holding 5-year-old Emma, both smiling at the camera. "Mom always told me that love was stronger than fear. I didn't understand what she meant until now." Richard studied the photograph, remembering the day it was taken. "Your mother would be so proud of all of you," he said softly. "Your strength, your compassion, your ability to turn pain into purpose." The Bennett Foundation had established a scholarship program in Grace's name, providing education and support for survivors of trafficking and abuse. The first recipient was a young woman Emma had helped rescue in Montreal, now studying social work with dreams of helping others like herself. Detective Hayes remained a close family friend, joining them for Sunday brunches and providing updates on the ongoing investigations. Sarah's network had been completely dismantled, its members prosecuted, its victims offered support and resources through the Bennett Center. The detective marveled at how 3 children's courage had exposed decades of corruption and changed countless lives. Mrs. Rosa, who had witnessed the family's journey from brokenness to healing, took particular joy in cooking elaborate meals that combined American comfort food with Italian and French influences. She treated all 3 Bennett children as her own grandchildren, teaching them family recipes and filling the kitchen with warmth and love. The mansion's security remained tight, a necessary precaution given their high-profile work, but it no longer felt like a fortress. Instead, it had become a sanctuary, not just for the Bennett family but for all who needed hope and healing. On Emma's 31st birthday, the family gathered in the garden for a celebration. Tommy and Emily had spent weeks planning surprises, including a cake decorated with flags of all the countries that had been part of their journey home. As they sang happy birthday in 3 languages, Richard looked at his children with wonder. Emma, survivor and protector, her strength now tempered with peace. Tommy, the brave truth-teller, growing into his role as brother and advocate. Emily, the fierce little warrior, her fear transformed into determination to help others. "Make a wish," Emily urged as Emma prepared to blow out her candles. Emma looked at her family, the father who had never stopped hoping, the brother who had risked everything for truth, the sister who had rushed into danger to save them all. "I already have everything I could wish for," she said softly. "We're home." The garden lights twinkled like stars as darkness fell, but there were no more shadows in the Bennett mansion. They had faced their nightmares, exposed their wounds to the light, and emerged stronger. Together they had proven that love truly was stronger than fear, that family could be lost and found, broken and healed. The evening ended with all 4 Bennett stargazing on the lawn, pointing out constellations and sharing stories. Their laughter drifted up into the night sky, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of love to light the way home. 5 years after Emma's return, the Bennett Children's Center hosted a landmark celebration. The occasion was the opening of its 10th international branch, this one in Paris, partnering with Madame Rousseau's shelter where Emma had first found her path to healing. The center's main hall was filled with survivors, advocates and families who had been touched by the Bennett legacy. Large photographs lined the walls, Tommy's first notebook that exposed the truth, Emily's teddy bear still keeping watch in the counseling center, Emma's foundation in Montreal. Each image told a story of transformation, of darkness turned to light. Richard stood at the podium, his 3 children beside him. At 16, Tommy had grown tall and confident. His book about surviving Hope Haven now required reading in child psychology programs worldwide. Emily, 13, wore her volunteer counselor badge proudly, already showing signs of the therapist she would become. Emma, now 35, directed the Bennett Foundation's global initiatives, her work having helped rescue and rehabilitate thousands of trafficking survivors. 20 years ago, Richard began, his voice steady with emotion. "I thought I had lost everything. My wife Grace, my daughter Emma, my purpose. I buried myself in wealth and work, blind to the suffering happening right in front of me. But fate, or perhaps Grace's lasting love, sent me a wake-up call in the form of a car accident and a brave little boy with a notebook." The audience listened intently as he continued. "That boy turned out to be my son, and through him, I found not only my lost daughter Emily, but eventually my Emma too. Our family story could have ended in tragedy. Instead, it became a testament to the power of truth, courage, and love." Detective Hayes, now the head of a specialized unit combating child trafficking, took the stage to share the statistics: hundreds of children rescued, dozens of trafficking networks dismantled, millions in resources dedicated to prevention and rehabilitation. But it was the personal stories that moved the audience to tears. A young woman from Montreal spoke about how Emma had helped her escape her traffickers and rebuild her life. A boy Tommy's age described how reading Tommy's book had given him the courage to speak out about his own abuse. A mother tearfully thanked Emily for sitting with her daughter through therapy sessions, showing that healing was possible. The Bennett siblings had each found their own way to transform their trauma into purpose. Tommy's advocacy work focused on empowering children to recognize and report abuse. Emily's peer counseling program, designed specifically for young survivors, was being implemented in children's centers worldwide. Emma's international network of safe houses and rehabilitation centers had become a model for survivor support. Mrs. Rosa, now officially Nonna to all 3 Bennett children, had expanded her role beyond the mansion's kitchen. She ran cooking therapy programs at the center, helping survivors reconnect with joy and normalcy through the simple act of preparing meals together. Her kitchen became a place of healing, where the aroma of fresh bread and the warmth of unconditional love helped rebuild shattered spirits. The Foundation Scholarship Program, named after Grace, had grown to support hundreds of survivors pursuing education and career training. Each recipient wore a small daisy pin, Emma's childhood favorite flower, becoming a symbol of hope and new beginnings. As the celebration continued, Richard watched his children interact with the guests, Tommy serious and compassionate, listening to a young survivor's story. Emily gentle and intuitive, helping a nervous child feel safe in the crowded room. Emma strong and nurturing, mentoring new advocates in trauma-informed care. The Bennett Mansion, once a silent monument to grief, had become the heart of a global movement. Its gates stood open to those in need, its gardens offering peace to troubled souls, its rooms echoing with the sounds of healing and hope. The day ended with a tradition that had begun at Emma's first birthday home stargazing in the garden. But now they weren't alone. Survivors, families, and advocates joined them on the lawn, sharing stories and dreams under the vast sky. Look, Emily pointed upward, a shooting star. Make a wish, Tommy said automatically, then smiled at the familiar phrase. Emma squeezed her father's hand as they watched their extended family of survivors and healers bond under the starlight. I think she said softly, Mom would be proud of what her love helped create. Richard looked at his children, living testaments to the power of resilience and redemption, and knew she was right. From the deepest darkness had come the brightest light, and the Bennett legacy would continue to shine hope into the shadows where children still waited to be found. 10 years to the day after Sarah's death, Richard Bennett stood in front of Hope Haven's former site. The old building had been demolished years ago, replaced by a sprawling garden of healing, a peaceful memorial to the children who had suffered there and a testament to those who had survived. At the center of the garden stood a bronze sculpture, created by Emily in her newly discovered passion for art therapy. It depicted 3 children holding hands in a circle, their faces turned upward toward the sky. Around the base, written in multiple languages, were the words "Truth breaks chains. Love lights the way. Hope heals all wounds." Tommy, now 21 and studying law with a focus on child advocacy, placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "Hard to believe this was once the scariest place in our world," he said softly. Emily, 18 and preparing for college where she would study psychology, nodded in agreement as she adjusted her camera to capture the morning light on the sculpture. Emma, 40 years old and recently married to a fellow survivor advocate, joined them with her infant daughter Grace in her arms. The baby, named for the grandmother she would never meet, represented everything they had fought for: the chance for a new generation to grow up free from fear and full of love. "I found something in Sarah's last journal," Detective Hayes said, approaching the family with a worn notebook. "I think you all need to see it." She opened to the final entry, written the night before Sarah's death. "I watched them, this family I tried to destroy, and I see everything I could have been. Richard's love for his children, their love for each other, it's the very thing I once longed for as a forgotten child. I chose darkness, believing it was my only option. But Tommy, Emily, and Emma chose light. Again and again, they are stronger than I ever was. In my final moments, I understand at last what Grace Bennett tried to teach me all those years ago: love is always the braver choice." Richard read the words aloud, his voice steady despite the emotion they stirred. For years, they had struggled to understand Sarah's descent into evil. This last confession offered not justification, but perhaps something more valuable: a final lesson about the power of choice and the strength required to choose love over hate. The Bennett Children's Center had grown into a global network, its methods revolutionizing trauma recovery and child protection. Tommy's book had inspired new legislation protecting vulnerable children. Emily's art therapy programs helped survivors find healing through creative expression. Emma's international advocacy had changed how the world approached trafficking prevention and survivor support. But perhaps their greatest achievement was simpler: they had learned to be happy. The nightmares had faded, replaced by dreams of future possibilities. The mansion rang with laughter, music, and the sounds of a family that had chosen joy despite knowing profound sorrow. Mrs. Rosa, now in her 70s but still the heart of the household, had trained a new generation of trauma-informed care workers in her cooking therapy program. "Food heals the body," she would say, "but love heals the soul." Her kitchen remained a sanctuary where survivors could find both. As the morning sun rose higher, more people arrived at the garden: survivors, advocates, families touched by the Bennett legacy. They gathered for the annual Day of Remembrance and Hope, a tradition that honored both the pain of the past and the promise of the future. Richard watched as his children moved through the crowd, each in their own way continuing the work of healing and protection. They had transformed their family's tragedy into a force for global change, but more importantly, they had learned to carry their scars with grace and their hopes with courage. Baby Grace cooed in Emma's arms, reaching for a butterfly that had landed on the sculpture. The simple gesture, a child feeling safe enough to wonder, to reach out, to explore, embodied everything they had fought for. "Dad," Emily called, gathering everyone for a photo. "Come on, we need you in this one." As Richard joined his family in front of the sculpture, he felt Grace's presence more strongly than ever. She would have been proud of their children, of the way they had chosen light over darkness, hope over fear, love over hate. The camera clicked, capturing the moment: 3 generations of survivors and healers standing in a garden built on the ashes of their darkest memories, their faces turned toward the sun. In their eyes shone the truth they had learned: that while pain may shape us, it is love that defines us, and hope that leads us home. Your voice matters to us. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. How did the Bennett family's journey of healing and hope resonate with you? Subscribe to join our storytelling community and never miss another powerful narrative. Help spread hope by sharing this video with friends and family who might need inspiration today. Your likes and engagement motivate us to continue bringing meaningful stories that celebrate the triumph of love over darkness. Together, let's build a community where stories of courage and redemption can inspire change.